So, we know that the PlayStation 5 event has been pushed back until Thursday, the 11th of June. None of the games we're about to discuss here do I think for a second will be at that event, although that would absolutely make it for me. But we need to consider what could return to the PlayStation 5 from the PlayStation's past. In this series, I'll be going through some hidden gems, forgotten games, and favourites of my own that I want to see from every PlayStation generation that's gone before PS5 that could return. PS1, as we know, was an awesome system. It's filled with some amazing games, loads of genres well represented, and a lot of games come to mind when you think of the series that are due another look on modern platforms. Some are obvious, Metal Gear, etc., some less so. Here's a few of my favourites from when I had a PS1 that have seemingly been forgotten by their developers, publishers, potentially by fans as well. They need to be considered for either a PS5 remake or at least a remaster. Alundra. Alundra was awesome. It was an action-adventure series. It only had 2 games. Both were on the original PS1, developed by Matrix Software and published by Cygnus, or Cygnus. I have no idea how you pronounce it. What an awesome game to me this was when it arrived in '98 in PAL territories. I think it came out the year before in America. Loads of clever puzzles, all delivered from a sort of top-down isometric kind of viewpoint. Anyone who might remember Landstalker on the Mega Drive or Sega Genesis, the game is a kind of sequel because it has some similar elements in its gameplay, but it's also made by the same guys who worked on that game. There was a sequel that came out the year after the original Alundra, but it had no shared storyline elements with the first game. It was like Final Fantasy, it was just a totally separate game bar the name. It was also a lot easier, a lot more childish and sort of whimsical, fantastical in its tone, and it wasn't as well received. It's been on ice now for 20 years as this franchise, and is well due a revisit for me on PS5. However, Cygnus were bought by Sony and obviously became Studio Liverpool, who were putting out the Wipeout games, and they were sadly shut down in 2012, so I don't even know where the rights for this exist, but for God's sake, bring Alundra back. Corny Wars. Another Cygnus published game, however this was also developed by the team as well, not just published by them. Corny Wars was sort of a space combat dogfighting series on the PS1, and it had 3 games, all released on the original PlayStation, which shows its popularity. It was really well regarded at the time, but no one ever talks about it. It blew me away how it looked at the time. As you can see from the video, it's a bit dated nowadays, obviously, but the thought of how beautiful those space vistas could look in 2020 on the PlayStation 5, well, it'd be amazing. And I think it'd just bring a bit of variety to Sony's first-party lineup, having a space dogfighting game, because we're very well served with the 3D third-person action-adventure games like Uncharted and Horizon and Last of Us. Get something different, and I think that's what this would give us. Cool Borders, or if I'm really putting myself out there, Cool Borders, as it used to say when it came on. This was a lot of people's first extreme sports game, or it was my own anyway. It came before Tony Hawk's, it came before SSX. It was awesome, but it's been totally forgotten in the aftermath of SSX, which came out with the PlayStation 2. Cool Borders actually had 5 games. Its last release was on both the PS1 and the PS2 back in 2001. The franchise was last developed by what has now become actually Deck 9, and weirdly their last game was the Life is Strange Before the Storm game, which was fantastic as well, a prequel to the original Life is Strange. With SSX seemingly being on ice as well, and a semi-resurgence, I think, in demand for games like this. Obviously we're seeing Tony Hawk's coming back with the remake of Pro Skater 1 and 2. I think this could be a great game to bring back for PS5. You could port it out maybe to one of Sony's second-party relationships. It's got a lot of history behind it. At the end of the day, it was 5 games and it's just kind of been forgotten. Destruction Derby. What a game this was. I think most people I know, if you had a PS1 you had Destruction Derby, or at least you played it. It was just a mindless car combat game, a genre I'm firmly of the opinion of we're massively starved of these days, and certainly in terms of good games. Destruction Derby actually got 3 sequels, 2 more games on the PS1 and then another finally on the PS2 called Destruction Derby Arena, but it's been silent now since then, and that was actually 16 years ago. That was a game also published by Cygnus, but like Wipeout, saw releases all over the place, not just on Sony platforms, so it was on like the Sega Saturn, and this actually went on the N64 as well. It was just a bit of brainless fun, and I think this could return with, multiplayer modes and stuff. It'd be great. Dino Crisis. Where on earth is this? Dino Crisis 1 and 2 were both on the PS1, and we sit here, get ready for this, 20 years on, if we obviously ignore the shocking Dino Crisis 3, which was exclusive to the original Xbox and was some sci-fi rubbish. We're all none the wiser as to why Capcom have just ignored this franchise for so long. It was essentially Resident Evil with dinosaurs, same tried and tested puzzle solving, key getting, shotgun pumping action of the original Resident Evil games. They're both fantastic. Surely in this age of remakes, this is more than overdue. I think this might be quite likely to happen as well after they've finished with the Resident Evil remakes, which obviously sounds like it'll be Resident Evil 4 next. Future Cop LAPD. What a game this was as well! A forgotten classic, in my opinion, for the PS1, and a game that, bar a PC port, is tied to that hardware. It's never been ported anywhere else. I'm under absolutely no illusions the likelihood of this coming back is tiny, but, you may as well dream. It was basically a third-person shooter-ish from a sort of isometric viewpoint. You played as a police mech. I mean, I don't know what else I really need to say other than that. And you storm the streets, loads of weapons, and blow things up. Don't know what else needs to be said. It sold around 200,000 copies from what I've looked at online, and was then followed by the studio actually splitting up, the guys that developed it, so it doesn't sound likely to ever be revisited, but this would be such a great game given a modern platform, and it's just one of those games that I think the people that did play it loved it, but there ain't many of us. G-Police. So looking at the footage, you're probably thinking, this looks like a cross between Corny Wars and Future Cop LAPD. And it kind of is. G-Police was a 97 game that came from, you guessed it, Cygnus to PS1 and PC, and you played as a kind of futuristic helicopter, and it was in a sort of Blade Runner style city, and you just shoot the bad guys up from above. Sometimes you'd have to scan civilians and stuff to make sure you were shooting the right people. It just felt so ahead of its time, so open. I remember how good it looked as well in the cockpit view. I was like, whoa, this looks insane at the time. It had one sequel, also on the PS1, called G-Police Weapons of Justice, and it's now just been unheard of since 1999. I think this, again, it would just mix up the first party offering from Sony, giving something a bit different. Bring it back. Gags. Where is Gags? This was everywhere when I was a kid, on every platform, and for a period of about 5 years you would struggle to find a console owner who hadn't played a Gex game, be that the full game or a demo. Amazingly though, to me anyway, only 3 were actually made in a period that amounted to 4 years. It just felt like you were everywhere forever when I was a kid, but obviously looking back I was totally wrong. It was basically a gecko that made pop culture references, like he parodied things like James Bond, and he was a wisecracking, slightly annoying 3D platform character, but I did kind of enjoy it. After 3 games, it never made its way past the Sega Saturn, PS1 and N64 era, and it's just remained dormant since '99, so it's 21 years old now since we last had a Gex game. Surely in this age of the likes of Crash and Spyro coming back and things like Yooka-Laylee doing so well, the time has come for the coolest gecko in town to return. Jet Moto. Jet Moto, it was a sort of jet ski hovercraft racing game, futuristic, that acted as a kind of cross between Wipeout and Wave Race 64. I love this game, and I didn't realise this, there was actually 3 Jet Moto games. I think I only had the first 2, and they were all exclusive to the PS1. Various attempts were actually underway to release a 4th game on the PS2, but they just got stuck in development hell, and the series has been abandoned following the last Jet Moto, which was Jet Moto 3 in 1999. and the actual developer Single Track did go on to make Twisted Metal 1 and 2 on the PS1, which is, of course, another franchise which deserves another chance, in my opinion, after a very poor attempt, in my opinion, at a reboot on the PlayStation 3. So yeah, Jet Moto, well overdue for another outing. Jumping Flash, a first-person 3D platform game from the first year of the PS1, and I mean, just saying that alone, you realise how ambitious this was. This game had you playing as a robotic rabbit, and was one of the first attempts at a fully realised 3D platforming game. 2 sequels were released, albeit the second one was actually only released in Japan. All were on the PS1, and you just have to think of this as kind of a historical artifact for the PlayStation. This was the real first attempt at a kind of mascot platformer. I think it's got a lot of significance to it, and the renaissance that the genre has undergone itself in the last 2-3 years with the likes of Crash and Spyro, I think that gives this a chance to make a go of it. You know, we've got Ratchet obviously on the PlayStation, which I think has kind of taken the mantle of mascot platformer, but give Jumping Flash a go. Klonoa should, in my opinion, be massive, and yeah, it's not. It's loved by those of us that know it and had it, and seemingly just ignored or forgotten in general terms within the video game landscape. It's a 2.5D platform game. At its heart, it does nothing really innovative, aside from it utilises a grab mechanic on enemies, which is a bit similar to Tombi on the PS1 and Mischief Makers on the N64. But it was just so fun to play, so beautiful to look at, and it did everything it set out to do so solidly. Now, Namco have revisited Klonoa a few times since the exclusive to PS1 original, with a beach volleyball game, a PS2 sequel, which I loved as well, and a Wii remake of the PS1 original, which I've never played. But yeah, it is high time for a Klonoa 3. I find it amazing that's not happened yet. Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. Soul Reaver was awesome. Action-adventure game with puzzle elements, a mix between sort of Tomb Raider and nightmare creatures. This game had it all, and everyone I know who had or experienced this game absolutely loved it. It was followed by a direct sequel on the PS2, but the Soul Reaver franchise, which kind of sits within the Legacy of Kain franchise itself and spun off from it into its own separate thing, has now remained dormant for 19 years, somewhat unbelievably. Now, there has actually been some very mild speculation over this possibly getting the remake or remaster treatment, and I think we can all agree that's well overdue at this point. Pandemonium. Pandemonium was a 2.5D platformer. It's fondly remembered by many, including me, and for some reason it only got 2 outings before being yet another victim of various studio acquisitions and closures. This would make a great budget title, I think, if remastered. It was just a fun platform. It was nothing spectacular, solid sort of 6 or 7 out of 10 game, but it's one of them ones that's got a great kind of legacy to it. Loads of people played this and had it. It was quite a cheap game, and it just seemed to be one that everyone had or had experienced, and I think it'd do actually quite well if it came back. And as I say, if you made it a cheaper title, maybe because it was quite, you know, a budget-ish game itself, I always felt, then I think it would do well. Parasite Eve. 2 Parasite Eve games were released for the PS1, although weirdly, only the sequel ever came out in PAL territories, so I'll acknowledge myself, I've never played the original Parasite Eve, and thus I can only kind of base my opinion on Parasite Eve 2 and the PSP game The Third Birthday, which also came out. But this franchise, it was sort of a hybrid of a survival horror game with RPG elements, and it's weird that it's not been revisited since the PSP game. It's always seemed an odd decision from Square, really, when you consider that it is well regarded. It's got, you know, a great fan base to it. I can see this being looked at again in the not too distant future by Square. Point Blank. Now, this is a series I absolutely adore, but it's also one I kind of understand the reticence to go back to. Why? Light guns. So many of the games I loved as a kid, Point Blank, Time Crisis, House of the Dead, Virtua Cop, all basically unplayable now on modern TVs unless you resort to using a pad, which is not really fit for purpose. Point Blank was a shooting gallery game. It had 2 lovable characters presenting a series of kind of different challenges. They all required different times of intense precision to get a high score at times. 3 games were released on the PS1, and the franchise has kind of largely remained dormant since Point Blank 3, bar a couple of mobile ports and an arcade game in Japan. I don't care how they make light guns work again, just please do, or at least make PlayStation Move controllers a bit cheaper. Syphon Filter still baffles me why this franchise was ditched, seemingly, by Sony, having been so prevalent on PS1 and PS2. The last Syphon Filter games were developed by Sony Bend, who made Days Gone on the PlayStation 4 last year, so it's highly unlikely they'll be returning to Syphon Filter soon, you'd imagine, as they'll probably be making Days Gone 2 for the PlayStation 5. The Syphon Filter was a third-person action adventure that had a few stealth elements to it, and it obviously looks very dated and basic now, but this was an awesome game when it released in '99, and you'd have to think it's worth going back to soon. Vib Ribbon, or Vibe Ribbon, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Strange little game that came out in the year 2000 for the PlayStation 1, and I loved this. It's a rhythm action game with levels that were actually created from the music that you were playing. So you put the disc in for Vibe Ribbon into your PS1, and then you take it out and put a CD in of whatever you were listening to in the year 2000, probably Blink-182 or something like that, if it's me. And then the level would be formed based on the songs from the CD. I think it was such a clever game, and obviously it was rhythm action, so you had to press buttons in time with the movements of the character to beat the stage. And I think an updated Vib Ribbon with Spotify functionality would be awesome. Do realise I am probably the only person in the world wanting this, so I won't expect that anytime soon, but I stand by the fact that that would be awesome. So that's just a few of the many PS1 franchises I would like to see return on the PlayStation 5. I didn't mention some obvious ones like Metal Gear Solid, Twisted Metal, Ape Escape, and a few others, as they've had recent-ish iterations on modern platforms, on PS3 or even on PS4, and I feel they're probably likely to get a second look regardless. But these ones, they need a bit of love, in my opinion. Have you got any suggestions for any oddities from the PS1 you would like to see get a modern day remaster, remake or sequel? Comment below and let me know.